She won't last another year anyway. Those were the words I heard as I stepped onto my own back patio, my hand wrapped around the smooth wooden handle of my cane. The laughter that followed was quiet, almost polite, the kind people use when they think they're being discreet. But at 72 years old, I had learned something important. People often mistake age for weakness. They assume slower steps mean slower thinking. They assume a cane means surrender. And standing there beneath the warm Florida sun, with the scent of grilled burgers drifting across my backyard and the sound of my family enjoying a Saturday afternoon together, I realized they had already written the ending to my story. They just forgot to ask me how it ended. I'm Margaret Sullivan, and this happened in Naples, Florida. My husband, Richard, and I bought our house 34 years ago. Back then, the neighborhood was little more than a collection of quiet streets lined with young palm trees and hopeful families. We raised our son Ethan there. We celebrated birthdays there. We survived hurricanes there. Every room held memories. Every wall carried a piece of our lives. Richard passed away 8 months before that afternoon. Some days I still expected to hear his footsteps in the hallway or find him sitting in his favorite chair with a newspaper folded neatly beside him. Grief has a strange way of lingering. It settles into ordinary moments when you least expect it. Since his passing, walking had become more difficult for me after a hip surgery that never fully restored my balance. The cane helped. It gave me confidence. But apparently, to some people, it also made me look fragile. My son Ethan had organized the family barbecue. At least that's what he told me. The backyard was full of people. Neighbors, friends, co-workers. My daughter-in-law Brittany moved through the crowd with effortless confidence, carrying drinks and sharing stories. She smiled when she saw me approaching. The smile never reached her eyes. "There she is," she said brightly. "How are you feeling today, Margaret?" The question sounded caring. The tone felt rehearsed. "Just fine," I answered, "enjoying the sunshine." "That's good," she replied before quickly turning her attention elsewhere. I found a seat beneath the covered lanai and watched everyone interact. Something felt different. Small things. Conversations that stopped when I came near. Glances exchanged across the table. Smiles that disappeared a little too quickly. At first I convinced myself it was my imagination. Grief can make people sensitive. Loneliness can create doubts where none exist. Then I heard it again. Not Brittany this time. One of her friends. Once the house changes hands, they'll finally have room to do what they want. Another voice answered softly, assuming she doesn't hold on forever. More laughter followed. My fingers tightened around my cane. The house changes hands. Such an odd thing to say about a home that still belonged to me. A home where I still paid every bill. A home where I still woke up every morning and made coffee in the same kitchen Richard and I designed together. Yet somehow, sitting there among my own family, I felt like a guest at a gathering planned for a future where I no longer existed. And for the first time since Richard died, I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. Something was happening right in front of me. Something nobody thought I would notice. They looked at my cane and saw the end of my story. What they didn't realize was that my story was only beginning. That evening, after the last car pulled away and the backyard finally fell silent, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, stirring the warm Florida air. For years, this kitchen had been the heart of our home. Richard and I had spent countless mornings here sharing breakfast before work and countless evenings talking long after dinner was over. Now the room felt larger somehow, quieter. I kept replaying the conversations from the barbecue in my mind. Not the words themselves, but the certainty behind them. The confidence. Nobody spoke as if they were imagining possibilities. They spoke as if decisions had already been made. Decisions involving my house. Decisions involving my future. Decisions involving me. Yet, somehow without me. I stood and slowly made my way to the living room. Family photographs lined the shelves. Ethan at age 10 holding a baseball trophy. Ethan graduating from college. Ethan and Brittany smiling on their wedding day. Looking at those pictures, I found myself searching for the moment everything changed. The moment my son stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an obstacle standing between him and something he wanted. Maybe it had not happened all at once. Maybe it happened the way most painful things happen. Quietly, slowly, one small step at a time. Over the following weeks, I began noticing things I had ignored before. Brittany stopped by more often than usual. At first, I thought she was being thoughtful. Then I realized most of her questions had little to do with me. She asked about insurance paperwork, property taxes, home maintenance costs, utility bills. One afternoon, she casually asked whether I had considered moving into a retirement community. She said it with a smile, as though she were offering helpful advice. I smiled back and told her I had not made any plans. Her expression tightened for just a second before she recovered. Another day, Ethan came over to help replace an outdoor light fixture. While he worked, he mentioned how expensive real estate had become in Naples. He talked about property values rising year after year. He spoke about investment opportunities and market timing. Then he glanced around the backyard and said, almost absent-mindedly, that the lot alone was probably worth more than most people realized. It was a strange comment. I remember staring at him and wondering whether he even realized how transparent he sounded. The house had become the center of every conversation. Not my health, not my happiness, not my grief. The house. A few days later, I opened my mailbox and found a brochure for an assisted living community nearly 30 miles away. The envelope had my name on it. There was no return address, no note, nothing. Just smiling seniors walking through beautifully landscaped grounds and promises of worry-free living. I carried the brochure inside and placed it on the counter. Then I laughed softly. To myself. Not because it was funny, because it was revealing. Somebody had already begun preparing for my departure. That realization should have hurt. Instead, it brought clarity. For months after Richard died, I had felt lost. I kept waiting for things to feel normal again, waiting for the loneliness to ease, waiting for my family to remember that I was still here. But sitting there with that brochure in front of me, I finally understood something. The people around me had been planning for a future without me. What they never considered was that I might start planning my own future first. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt something stronger than sadness. I felt awake. The more attention I paid, the more impossible it became to ignore the pattern. It was never one large event that exposed the truth. It was dozens of small moments, each one insignificant on its own, yet impossible to dismiss when placed together. One Thursday afternoon, Brittany stopped by carrying iced coffees from a cafe downtown. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and spoke in the cheerful tone she always used when she wanted something. She asked about my doctor's appointments. She asked whether my hip still bothered me. She asked if I was sleeping well. At first, it sounded like concern. Then she casually mentioned a retirement community she had toured with a friend. She described the walking paths, the social activities, and the maintenance-free lifestyle. I listened quietly while stirring cream into my coffee. You would never have to worry about yard work again, she said. You would have people around you all the time. I smiled politely. I have neighbors around me already. For a moment, her expression froze. Only for a second. Then the smile returned. Of course you do. Later that evening, after she left, I found myself standing at the front window looking out across the street. My neighbor, Eleanor Watkins, was watering flowers near her mailbox. Eleanor had lived there almost as long as Richard and I. She knew every family on the block and noticed everything. The next morning, she waved me over while I was checking my mail. Margaret, she said carefully. I almost did not mention this, but I think you should know. My stomach tightened immediately. Know what? Eleanor hesitated. A few weeks ago, I was having lunch downtown and saw Brittany meeting with a real estate agent. I frowned. A real estate agent? She nodded. At first, I thought she was helping a friend buy a house. Then I heard her mention your address. I felt completely still. Eleanor continued. She was talking about renovation ideas, property value, future plans. I remember because it seemed strange. Strange. That was one word for it. I thanked her and walked back inside. The house felt unusually quiet. I sat in Richard's old chair and stared at the family photos across the room. For several minutes, I did nothing. I simply thought. Brittany had been researching retirement communities. Brittany had been discussing my property with a real estate agent. Ethan had become obsessed with market values and land prices. Suddenly, the pieces no longer looked random. They looked connected. A week later, another piece fell into place. Ethan invited me to dinner at his house. Throughout the evening, Brittany dominated the conversation. She spoke about home design trends and kitchen remodels. At one point, she opened a design application on her tablet and began showing photographs of renovated living rooms. I love open floor plans, she said. You can completely transform a house if you remove the right walls. Then she caught herself. Her eyes widened slightly. Ethan quickly changed the subject. But the damage had already been done. Neither of them realized I had noticed. Neither of them realized I was paying attention now. Driving home that night, I felt surprisingly calm. Months earlier, these discoveries would have broken my heart. Now they gave me clarity. People reveal themselves when they believe the outcome is already guaranteed. They become careless, confident, predictable. As I pulled into my driveway, I looked at the house illuminated by the soft glow of the porch lights. Richard had always called it our fortress, not because it was grand, but because it represented everything we built together. For the first time, I began wondering what would happen if I stopped protecting everyone else's expectations and started protecting my own future instead. And once that thought entered my mind, it refused to leave. The following Saturday, I found myself standing in the hallway outside Richard's old study. The room had remained almost untouched since he passed away. His desk still sat beneath the window overlooking the backyard. His reading lamp remained exactly where he left it. For months, I had avoided spending much time there. Some memories felt too heavy to carry every day. But that morning, something pulled me inside. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe it was the growing realization that I needed to stop looking backward and start understanding what stood in front of me. I lowered myself carefully into his leather chair and opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside were folders, documents, and handwritten notes that Richard always insisted on organizing himself. He trusted very few people with financial matters. Paper tells the truth when people do not, he used to say. As I sorted through the files, I found property records, insurance policies, tax statements, and legal documents stretching back decades. Everything was neatly labeled in his familiar handwriting. Then I found a folder with my name written across the tab. My heart tightened slightly. I opened it and began reading. Inside were copies of our estate planning documents, ownership records, and letters from our attorney. I read every page carefully. Then I read them again. The realization settled over me slowly. The house belonged entirely to me. Not partially, not conditionally, entirely. Richard had arranged everything years earlier. There were no hidden claims, no automatic transfers, no future ownership rights waiting for Ethan. The assumptions everyone seemed to be making existed only in their own minds. I sat back in the chair and stared out the window. For months, I had allowed myself to feel vulnerable. I had assumed age automatically meant dependence. I had assumed grief made me weaker. But the truth sitting in front of me was very different. Legally, financially, and practically, I remained in complete control of my future. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery carrying fresh flowers. The Florida sky stretched endlessly overhead, bright blue and cloudless. I stood beside Richard's headstone and quietly told him everything. The comments, the retirement brochures, the conversations about the house, the real estate agent, the plans being made around me. The words felt strange spoken aloud. Yet as I stood there, I could almost hear his response. Not the exact words, just the certainty he always carried. Richard had never been intimidated by difficult decisions. He believed problems became smaller the moment you faced them honestly. When I finally returned home, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because the situation had improved. If anything, the truth was more disappointing than I wanted to admit. The people closest to me appeared far more interested in my property than my well-being. But uncertainty had disappeared. I was no longer guessing. I was no longer questioning my instincts. That evening, Ethan called. He asked how I was feeling and whether I needed help with anything around the house. His voice sounded warm, concerned, familiar. Yet now I heard something beneath it. Expectation. I answered politely and thanked him for checking on me. Then I ended the call and sat quietly in the living room. Outside, the porch lights illuminated the driveway Richard and I had used for more than 3 decades. Inside, the house felt different. Not smaller, not emptier, stronger. Because for the first time since his death, I stopped viewing myself as the woman everyone expected me to become. And I started remembering the woman I had always been. Over the next few weeks, I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped correcting people. I stopped defending myself. I stopped trying to convince anyone that I was stronger than I looked. If Brittany wanted to believe I was becoming frail, I let her believe it. If Ethan wanted to assume I would eventually leave the house behind, I allowed the assumption to grow. There was a strange freedom in silence. The less I explained, the more they revealed. One afternoon, Brittany offered to help organize some storage boxes in the garage. I agreed. As we sorted through old holiday decorations and gardening tools, she casually asked whether I had considered downsizing my belongings. It might make things easier later, she said. Later. Such an interesting word. Not if. Not someday. Later. As though the decision had already been made and only the timing remained uncertain. I smiled and told her I would think about it. She seemed pleased with that answer. Far more pleased than the conversation deserved. Another week passed. Then another. The pattern continued. Ethan called more often, but most of his questions revolved around practical matters. Had I renewed the homeowner's insurance? Was the roof still in good condition? Did I plan to update the kitchen appliances? None of the questions were inappropriate on their own. Yet together they painted a picture that became impossible to ignore. They were not preparing to help me live in the house. They were preparing to inherit it. One evening I attended a neighborhood gathering hosted by Eleanor. Several longtime residents were there, including a retired attorney named Charles Bennett. During the conversation, Charles mentioned recent home sales in the area. Property values had increased dramatically over the previous few years. Some of these homes are receiving multiple offers within days, he said, especially properties with large lots. I listened carefully without saying much. Later, as people began leaving, Charles and I found ourselves talking alone on the patio. He had known Richard for years. We discussed old memories, neighborhood changes, and retirement. Before I left, he looked at me thoughtfully and said, "Margaret, forgive me if this sounds personal, but Richard always admired your judgment. Do not let anyone convince you that age requires surrender." The words stayed with me long after I returned home. That night, I sat on the back porch watching the sky darken over the palm trees. Crickets chirped softly in the distance. A warm breeze moved through the yard. For months, I had viewed my future through the lens of loss. Loss of Richard. Loss of certainty. Loss of the life we built together. But something was changing. The future no longer looked like a shrinking path. It looked like a choice. The next morning, I opened a notebook and began writing. Not emotional thoughts. Practical ones. Possibilities. Options. Questions. What kind of life did I want now? Where did I truly want to live? What responsibilities was I carrying simply because others expected me to carry them? The list grew longer each day. As I filled those pages, a realization slowly emerged. Everyone around me seemed focused on what would happen to the house after I was gone. Nobody had considered what might happen if I made a decision while I was still very much here. And once that possibility entered my mind, it became impossible to ignore. For the first time, I was not thinking about protecting the house. I was thinking about what the house could allow me to do next. 3 days later, I made an appointment with an attorney. Not because I had already decided what to do, but because I wanted facts instead of assumptions. For too long, everyone around me seemed comfortable making plans based on what they hoped would happen. I preferred certainty. The law office was located in a quiet building near downtown Naples. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. As I sat there with my cane resting beside my chair, I noticed how differently people looked at older women. Some smiled politely. Some offered unnecessary help. Many assumed weakness before hearing a single word. I had spent months allowing those assumptions to bother me. That morning, they no longer did. The attorney, a thoughtful woman named Rebecca Turner, listened carefully as I explained my situation. I told her about Richard's passing. I told her about the house. I told her about the conversations that seemed innocent on the surface but carried a deeper meaning underneath. Rebecca never interrupted. When I finished speaking, she folded her hands and asked a simple question. "Margaret, what do you want?" The question caught me off guard. Not because it was complicated, because nobody had asked it in a very long time. What did I want? Not what Ethan wanted. Not what Brittany expected. Not what neighbors assumed. What did I want? For a moment, I did not answer. Then I smiled. "I want choices." Rebecca nodded. "Then let us talk about your options." For nearly 2 hours, we discussed possibilities. We reviewed ownership documents, estate planning, financial flexibility, future housing opportunities. By the time I left the office, I felt something I had not experienced since Richard died. Confidence. Not because a decision had been made, because I finally understood that I still had complete control over my life. During the following weeks, I quietly gathered information. I visited communities along the Gulf Coast. I toured smaller homes and condominiums. I spoke with financial advisors. I reviewed budgets. Every step remained private. The more information I collected, the more excited I became. Meanwhile, Ethan and Brittany continued behaving exactly as before. One Sunday afternoon, they came over for lunch. Brittany spent half the meal talking about renovation trends. Ethan discussed property values again. Neither realized how carefully I listened. At one point, Brittany looked around the dining room and said, "This house has so much potential." Potential. Such a fascinating word. To me, it represented memories. To her, it seemed to represent opportunity. I simply smiled and changed the subject. That evening, after they left, I walked slowly through every room. The living room, where Richard taught Ethan how to build model airplanes. The kitchen, where we celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. The guest room, where visiting relatives stayed during holidays. I expected sadness. Instead, I felt gratitude. The memories were not trapped inside the walls. They belonged to me. Wherever I went, they would go too. That realization changed everything. The house had become larger than I needed and more valuable than I ever imagined. More importantly, it had become the center of expectations that were never mine. Standing in the hallway, I looked around one final time before turning off the lights. The decision was not fully made yet, but for the first time, I could see it clearly taking shape. And somewhere deep inside, I suspected that when the time came, the people who thought they understood my future were going to be very surprised by the choice I made. 2 weeks later, the plan moved from possibility to reality. Rebecca connected me with a highly respected real estate agent named Daniel Mercer. Unlike most people I had spoken with recently, Daniel never looked at my cane before speaking to me. He looked directly at me. He asked thoughtful questions. He listened carefully. Most importantly, he treated me like the decision maker. During our first meeting, he walked through the property taking notes while I shared the history of the house. The original renovations Richard and I completed ourselves. The hurricane-resistant windows we installed years earlier. The landscaping projects we spent weekends building together. Daniel appreciated the details. When he finished his evaluation, he sat at the kitchen table and reviewed current market conditions. The numbers surprised even me. Demand remained extremely strong. Inventory was limited. Properties in our neighborhood were selling quickly. Some received multiple offers within days. As Daniel explained the market, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. For months, I had viewed the house primarily as a symbol of my past. Now I began seeing it as a tool that could support my future. A few days later, professional photographs were taken. The process felt strangely emotional. Each room appeared beautiful in the images. Sunlight streamed through the windows. The hardwood floors gleamed. The backyard looked exactly as Richard had always wanted it to look. Yet instead of sadness, I felt appreciation. We had built something meaningful. Nothing could take that away. The listing went live on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, Daniel called with exciting news. Several showings had already been scheduled. Interest was stronger than expected. Throughout the process, I told very few people what was happening. Eleanor knew. Rebecca knew. Daniel knew. Everyone else remained unaware, including Ethan and Brittany. Keeping the information private was easier than I expected. They had become so confident in their assumptions that they rarely asked direct questions anymore. They simply continued discussing future plans as though those plans already belonged to them. One Sunday afternoon, Ethan called to invite me to dinner. Brittany spent most of the evening discussing home design ideas again. New flooring, expanded kitchens, updated landscaping. Listening to her felt almost surreal. She spoke as though she were describing a project already underway. At one point she laughed and said, "Sometimes I think people hold on to houses longer than they should." I smiled politely and took another sip of iced tea. Ethan nodded in agreement. Neither of them noticed the irony hanging in the air between us. The following week, Daniel called again. An offer had arrived. Then another. Then a third. All above asking price. I sat quietly in my living room reviewing the details while sunlight stretched across the floorboards. Outside, palm fronds swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Inside, my future was beginning to take shape. After careful consideration, I accepted an offer from a retired couple relocating from Colorado. They loved the neighborhood. They loved the yard. They planned to spend their retirement years creating new memories there. Their excitement reminded me of how Richard and I felt when we first purchased the property decades earlier. The closing process moved quickly. Documents were signed. Deadlines were scheduled. Plans were finalized. Through it all, I remained surprisingly peaceful. The decision no longer felt complicated. It felt right. One evening, after another productive conversation with Daniel, I stood in the backyard watching the sunset paint the sky shades of orange and pink. For months, everyone around me had assumed they understood how my story would end. They saw age. They saw grief. They saw a woman leaning on a cane. What they failed to see was that I had quietly taken control of the narrative while they were busy imagining ownership of something that was never theirs. And with every document completed and every signature added, the moment of truth moved closer than any of them could possibly imagine. The closing date arrived on a bright Tuesday morning. The Florida sun reflected off the windows of the title company building as I walked inside, carrying a folder and a sense of calm that surprised me. Months earlier, I would have entered that room feeling uncertain. Now I felt steady. Every document had been reviewed. Every detail had been considered. Every choice had been mine. The meeting itself was remarkably simple. Signatures, confirmations, handshakes. The retired couple purchasing the property seemed genuinely excited. They spoke about gardening projects, family visits, and evenings on the lanai. Listening to them reminded me of the hope Richard and I carried when we first moved into the neighborhood all those years ago. By early afternoon, everything was complete. The house officially belonged to someone else. I sat in my car afterward and looked at the final paperwork resting on the passenger seat. There was no sadness, only relief. The chapter had ended exactly when I wanted it to end, not when someone else decided it should. Over the next several days, movers carefully packed my belongings. I had already purchased a beautiful condominium overlooking the Gulf, smaller than the house, but perfectly suited to the life I wanted moving forward. The building offered security, convenience, and a breathtaking view of the water. Most importantly, it represented freedom. Freedom from expectations. Freedom from maintenance. Freedom from living inside a future someone else had designed for me. Throughout the moving process, I remained quiet. Ethan and Brittany knew I had been organizing things, but neither seemed concerned. They assumed I was simply decluttering, preparing for another phase of retirement. The confidence in their assumptions almost fascinated me. They had become so comfortable with their version of reality that they never stopped to verify whether it was true. One Friday morning, the moving trucks arrived. Large white vehicles lined the curb outside the house. Workers carried furniture, boxes, and personal belongings through the front door. I stood near the driveway directing traffic and answering questions. Around noon, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Ethan stepped out first. Brittany followed immediately behind him. Both stared at the trucks with visible confusion. "Mom," Ethan called as he hurried toward me. "What is going on?" I smiled politely. "I am moving." He looked around the property. "Moving where?" "To my new condominium." Brittany blinked several times. "Your new condominium?" Her voice sounded unusually strained. "What about the house?" I reached into my folder and removed a copy of the closing documents. "The house has been sold." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Ethan stared at the papers as though he had misheard me. Brittany's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Sold?" she repeated quietly. "You sold the house?" "Yes," I answered. "Several weeks ago." The silence that followed felt remarkably peaceful. No raised voices. No dramatic scene. Just the quiet collapse of assumptions that had existed for far too long. Ethan finally looked up from the paperwork. "Why did you not tell us?" I considered the question carefully. Then I gave him an honest answer. Because nobody asked what I wanted. Everyone seemed far more interested in deciding my future than listening to me describe it. Neither of them responded. They simply stood there looking at the moving trucks, the paperwork, and the reality unfolding in front of them. For months, they had viewed me through the lens of limitation. They saw a widow. They saw a cane. They saw age. What they failed to see was a woman who still knew exactly how to make her own decisions. As another truck pulled away from the curb carrying the last pieces of my old life, I realized something important. I had never been protecting a house. I had been protecting my right to choose. And that right had never belonged to anyone else. My new condominium overlooked the Gulf exactly as the brochure promised. Every morning, sunlight danced across the water outside my balcony. Pelicans drifted over the waves. Palm trees swayed in the breeze below. For the first time in nearly a year, I found myself looking forward instead of backward. The adjustment was easier than I expected. The space was smaller, but it felt lighter. Simpler. There were no empty rooms filled with ghosts of old expectations. Only the life I had chosen for myself. During the first few weeks after the move, Ethan called several times. Our conversations were polite but different. The confidence that had once colored his voice was gone. In its place was uncertainty. More than once, he apologized for making assumptions. More than once, he admitted that he had not fully understood how his actions had affected me. I appreciated the honesty, but I also understood something important. Trust is rebuilt through actions, not words. Brittany called only once. The conversation was brief. She said she had been surprised by my decision. I told her that surprises usually happen when people assume they already know the ending of someone else's story. After that, there was a long silence between us. I did not argue. I did not criticize. I simply allowed the truth to exist. Life became pleasantly routine. I joined a book club. I started taking morning walks along the waterfront. My hip continued improving, and although I still used my cane, I noticed something had changed. The cane no longer felt like a symbol of limitation. It felt like what it had always been, a tool. Nothing more, nothing less. The meaning others attached to it had never belonged to me in the first place. One afternoon, several months after the move, I attended a neighborhood gathering in the condominium community. As I stood talking with new friends, a woman asked whether I missed my old house. The question made me smile. I thought about the backyard Richard loved, the family dinners, the holiday decorations, the years of memories. Then I thought about everything that happened afterward. I miss certain moments, I answered honestly. But moments travel with you. Houses do not. That evening, I returned home and stood on my balcony watching the sunset settle over the Gulf. The sky glowed shades of gold, orange, and pink. It reminded me of something Richard used to say whenever life became complicated. He believed people revealed their character when circumstances changed, not when everything was easy, when expectations failed, when plans shifted, when control disappeared. Looking back, I realized this experience had revealed more than I ever expected. It revealed assumptions hidden beneath polite conversations. It revealed how easily people mistake kindness for weakness. Most importantly, it revealed that I had spent too much time allowing others to define what strength looked like. They saw a widow carrying a cane and imagined decline. They saw age and imagined dependence. They saw grief and imagined surrender. What they failed to see was resilience. They failed to see experience. They failed to see a woman who had spent decades building a life and who still possessed every right to shape the next chapter herself. The funny thing is that selling the house was never really the victory. The victory happened much earlier. It happened the moment I stopped waiting for permission to make my own choices. It happened the moment I remembered that my future belonged to me. And as the final rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, I felt grateful. Not for the misunderstandings, not for the disappointment, but for the lesson hidden inside both. Because sometimes the people who underestimate you end up giving you the clearest reminder of exactly who you are.